Good day, everyone. I am Jemery Mijares, and together with my groupmates, we'll be discussing an interesting topic in literary criticism, which is formalism and new criticism. So, our lesson for today focuses on understanding how these two approaches analyze literature by looking closely at the form, structure, and language of a text rather than its author or historical background. And for our lesson objectives, by the end of our discussion, you should be able to identify and explain the key concepts and principles of formalism and new criticism, appreciate the value of focusing on a text form and structure in understanding its meaning, and apply the principles of formalism and new criticism in analyzing a selected literary text. To begin our discussion, let us know first what is formalism. So, formalism is a literary approach that focuses on the intrinsic qualities of a literary work. So, this means it pays attention to the form, structure, and literary devices used in the text rather than the author's life, historical background, or social influences. Formalists also believe that literature is a special kind of human knowledge with its own language, rules, and artistic techniques, and for them, a poem or story should be analyzed as an independent work, something that stands on its own. They also emphasize studying the relationship between different literary elements like imagery, rhythm, tone, and symbolism, and how these work together to create a meaning. In short, formalism teaches us to focus on how a literary piece is written, not who wrote it or why it was written. So now let's talk about the history and origin of formalism. Formalism began in Russia during the early 1900s as a response to the older way of studying literature, which focused more on the author's background and historical context. So the formalists, they wanted to make literary studies more scientific and objective, focusing only on what is inside the text itself. The movement was influenced by Ferdinand de Saussure, a linguist who described language as a system of signs. The idea helped the formalists see literature as a structured system where meaning is built through form and language. Some of the most well-known Russian formalists were Viktor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, and Boris Eichenbaugh. They were members of groups such as the Moscow Linguist Circle and OPAYAS, which is the Society for the Study of Poetic Language. Their main goal was to study how literary works achieve their effect through technique and structure, paving the way for later theories like structuralism and new criticism.
Good day, everyone. I am Quencel Abrenica Lilok, and now I will be discussing the main proponents and their works. So first, we have here Viktor Shklovsky. So who is Viktor Shklovsky? He is one of the leaders of the Russian formalist movement. He introduced the idea of defamiliarization, making ordinary things seem new and strange, so readers can see them differently. So the main idea here is that writers should make language fresh and unique so readers really notice the words and form, not just the story. For example, in his essay Art as Technique, 1917, he said that a writer could describe something simple like brushing teeth in an unusual way to make readers experience it freshly, not just as a routine action. The second one is Roman Jakobson. He is one of the Russian linguists and literary theorists. He studied how language works in literature, especially how sound and word choices create meaning and emotion. So the main idea here is he talked about the poetic function of language, how the way something is said, the form, or it just as important as what is being said, the content. So, for example, in Linguistics and Poetics, 1960, Jacobson explained how poems use sound patterns like rhyme or rhythm to make language itself meaningful, not just the message. The third one, we have Boris Echenbaum. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he was a Russian formalist critic who focused on the literary fact. He believed that literature should be studied as its own art form, not mixed with history or the author's life. So, the most important thing in studying literature is the structure and technique the author used, or how the story is told. For example, in the theory of the formal method, 1926, he analyzed how Tolstoy's writing style, his sentence patterns, and use of detail shape readers' feelings instead of focusing on Tolstoy's personal life. The next one we have Yuri Tynyanov or Tynyanov. But anyways, he was also a writer and a critic who looked at literature as a dynamic system that changes over time. So he studied how literary forms evolve. For example, how old styles influence new ones. He believed literature is always developing and interacting with other art forms. So, the problem of verse language, 1924, he explained how poetry's rhythm and structure affect its meaning, not just the words themselves. The fifth and the last is none other than Boris Tomaszewski. So he was a Russian literary theorist who worked on poetics, the study of how literature is structured and how it functions as an art form. So the main idea is he analyzed how parts of a story like plot, theme, and characters are organized and how they work together to create meaning. So for example, in Thematics 1925, he showed how stories have a pabula, the actual events, and a sujet, the way the events are arranged by the author, helping readers to understand how structure creates literary effect. And I guess that would be all on my part. May I call on Mom Nova for further discussion? Thank you.
Hi everyone! Today I'll be talking about the core principles of formalism in literature. So, formalism focuses on the form and the structure of literary work. Formalists believe that instead of looking at the author's life or emotions, we should focus on how the text is written, its language, style, imagery, and organization, because these elements create the overall meaning and beauty of the work. One key idea in formalism is defamiliarization. It means that literature makes ordinary things seem new or different. Writers do this to help us see the world in a fresh way and appreciate things we usually overlooked. Formalists also practice close reading, which means carefully analyzing the details of the text, like the symbols, patterns, and tone, to understand how they connect to the whole piece. Another important concept is literariness. This is what makes a text truly literary, the artistic use of language that separates it from normal writing. And lastly, formalists talk about literary evolution, which is how literary forms and styles change over time as writers experiment and respond to new ideas. In short, formalism teaches us to appreciate literature for its form, structure, and creative techniques, the art that lies within the words themselves. That would be all for my part. Now, to continue our discussion, let me turn you over to Miss Christine Abejo, who will be explaining the next slide. Thank you.
Neo-criticism came from the ideas of formalism and became popular around the mid-1900s. It teaches us that when we study a story or a poem, we should treat it as a complete and independent piece, something that it can stand on its own. This means we look closely at the text itself, examining every word and detail to find its own meaning, without depending on outside information. Famous new critics like Jan Kerr Ransom, Alan Tate, and Clint Brook believe that we should focus only on what's inside the text or what's inside the words, like its language, structures, and symbols, not on the author's life or the time period. What matters most is that what's inside the text, not who wrote it or why. New criticism is all about reading carefully. When analyzing a poem or a story, we pay attention on how the author uses language, images, and symbols to express deeper meanings. For example, if we study a poem about the storm, we might look at how the storm symbolizes emotional conflict or change. New critics say we shouldn't try to guess what the author wanted to say. This idea, called the intentional fallacy, that means instead of asking what did the writer mean to say, we ask what does the text itself say. The focus stays on the words on the page, not the writer's personal intention. New critics argue that you can't just summarize a story or a poem and think you've captured its meaning. The real meaning lies in the way how the words are put together. The tone, the rhythm, and structure all matter. We might say you can't explain a poem just by restating it. You have to experience how it's written. For new critics, good literature often contains contradictions or layers of meaning. Irony, paradox, and ambiguity make a work richer and more interesting. We might point out how a line in a poem can have two meanings at once. This shows that the text is full of complexity.
So, hi everyone! Let's now jump into my part, which is analytical techniques and methods. Okay, so close reading is the foundation of the literary analysis in these schools of thought. So it means carefully studying the words, phrases, and the structure of the text without considering the author's biography and the historical background. Okay, so this approach focuses solely on what is inside the text, like how the imagery, symbol, and the tone, of course, the language choices contribute to the meaning. Okay, so by paying attention to one another, close reading helps reveal the deeper layer of the interpretations and shows how the work functions as a unified artistic whole. Analytical techniques and methods, it highlights how the form and structure of literary work, so its rhythm, imagery, and even the sounds, shapes its meaning and aesthetic beauty. So, formalist critics believe that the arrangement of the literary elements is intentional and meaningful. So, the idea of the binary opposition, such as the light versus dark, the love and hate, and also the life versus death, is the key understanding how contrast creates tension and the meaning within the text. So, by analyzing these opposites, critics can uncover underlying themes and conflicts that give the work its depth and coherence. So these analytical methods involved examining how two or more texts or different parts within one text differ or resemble each other. So through comparison and contrast, highlight what makes each work unique in a form, tone, and artistic expression. Okay, so for example, comparing the characters, symbol, or themes helps reveal how the meaning is constructed differently, of course. So this technique not only depends understanding, but also emphasizes the craftsmanship and literary artistry behind each piece of the writing.
Now, let's talk about the critics and limitations. The first one is formalism and new criticism are often criticized for focusing too much on the text itself while ignoring its historical, social, and cultural background. This means people think formalism and new criticism only care about what's inside the text, not the events, culture, or society that influenced it. The second one is critics say this approach can be too narrow, mechanical, and detached from the author's intent or the reader's role. Some say it feels too strict and lifeless because it ignores what the author meant and how readers personally understand the work. And then the third one is that some also view it as elitist for separating literature from real life issues and limiting what count as great works. Other thinks it favors only certain types of literature and overlooks stories that deal with real life problems, making it seem unfair or exclusive. And the last one, despite these criticisms, both approaches greatly influence literary studies by promoting close reading and viewing text as rich, artistic creations. So, even with the negatives, formalism and new criticism still help people appreciate literature deeply by teaching readers to analyze every details and see text as art.
Formalists believe that to truly understand a piece of literature, we should focus only on what's inside the text itself. Its language, structure, symbol, and style, not the author's life or historical background. This idea led to the method called close reading, where readers pay careful attention to every word, line, and pattern. Because of this approach, many modern scholars and teachers today still use close reading as a main way to study and interpret literature.
Now, in the continuation of legacy and influence on literary studies, we have here the third one. The formalism and new criticism introduce key ideas like defamiliarization, literariness, and the heresy of paraphrase, which still influence modern literary studies and inspired later theories such as structuralism and semiotics. And we have here our last number, the fourth one, which is this is that their limitations led to new approaches like Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial criticism, yet their focus on form and close reading continues to shape how literature is analyzed and appreciated today. Formalism and new criticism focus on the analyzing the form, structure, and the language of a literary text rather than the author's background or historical context. They introduce important ideas such as defamiliarization, which means making ordinary things seem new or strange to help readers see them differently, and literariness, which refers to the qualities that make a text distinctly literary. Another key idea, the heresy of paraphrase, suggests that a poem or story cannot be fully explained by simply summarizing it, because its meaning depends on its exact words and structure. This concept strongly influenced later theories like structuralism and semiotics, which also explore meaning it's created through language and its form. Now, despite the limitations of certain traditional approaches to literary analysis, they paved the way for newer approaches like Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial criticism. However, the traditional focus on analyzing the form of literature in close reading techniques still influences how literature should studied and appreciated today. In short, old methods led to new perspectives, but their core techniques remain relevant in literary analysis. Though formalism and new criticism still shaped how we understand and enjoy literature that we have today.
Reporters 1. Abello, Christine B. 2. Baldivino, Novalia T. 3. De Leon, Angel B. 4. Lilac, Quincelé. 5. Olivar, Lovely. 6. Mayaris, Demery.